Hello everyone, and welcome to this mobile edition of the Anti-Dem podcast, such as it is, here on YouTube until I find some other service for it which will not cost me an arm and a leg and also will host all of my files. This is a mobile edition because I am headed on a long cross-country road trip, which will take me from the San Francisco Bay Area, eventually out to the west coast of Florida, where I'll be staying for most of the summer. Stop one is going to be Las Vegas, which is where I'm heading right now. And I am somewhere around Fresno, California on I-5, headed southbound towards Las Vegas. Now, I have recently bought a Zoom H2N mobile recorder, and I got a Audio-Technica lavalier mic to go along with that. A lavalier is, one of those little tie clip microphones that you see reporters and all that using. And part of the reason behind getting the lavalier was, I figured I would have a lot of time on my hands in the next couple of weeks. Any of you who have not done a cross-country drive, especially done one alone, and I've done several of them alone or with other people, you get a lot of time on your hands. There are big, long stretches of highway that just go on and on and on. And, after a while, as much as I like listening to the podcasts I've got on my phone and all that, and as much as the radio may entertain you for some amount of time, eventually you just sort of run out of stuff to listen to. And I am that type of person who does get easily bored. So I figured, hey, might as well go ahead and, record some stuff while I'm driving. I actually got the idea for it from a podcast called the Nightwise podcast, Knightwise. And it's a European who does a technology-focused podcast and records a lot in his car. So I figured, hey, why not? Give it a shot. If you hear any hissing in the background, that is my car's air conditioning system going full blast. And no, I'm not going to turn it off to record the show. I just caught a little snippet of local radio that says that it's 106 degrees outside. So no, I'm not going to turn the air conditioning off anytime soon. Hopefully, as I get to know a little bit more about this microphone and its noise-reducing features, I can make things so that the audio quality is okay and, hopefully a little better than the Angry Birds show a couple of weeks ago, where the hissing air conditioner at the Emeryville Public Market really made it sound terrible. So what you're going to hear in the shows that I record on the road are going to be some disjointed thoughts, just random things that come to me as I drive along. I tend to get ideas for blog posts actually in two places more than any other. I get them while I'm driving, or I get them in church, because those two places clear my mind more than it will be any place else. I don't have any distractions. I'm not typing something on the internet. I'm not sitting in front of the TV or any of that stuff. The problem, of course, is that then it makes it really hard to write down my ideas. And I keep a little notebook and a pen in the car, and even take them with me into church in order to write down the ideas that I have, which is sometimes rather rude while my priest is trying to deliver his homily, but, sorry, we'll say it's in the name of my art. So, as I get these ideas, as I drive along, I'm just going to, pop the microphone on and start talking. Some of them probably will be about the places that I'm going, the places I've been, the things that I've seen, and some's just going to be total off the wall. So let's start today with a little bit of off the wall. It's Monday today, and I am on the road after last night having watched the season finale of Season 6 of Game of Thrones. Now, I just recently wrote a blog post about Game of Thrones called How King Tommen Won Like a Boss. And he did, and no, by the way, spoilers for the last episode of Season 6 of Game of Thrones. If you haven't watched it, turn this off and go watch it, and then come back and listen to what I've got to say about it. So no, what happened last night doesn't change anything that I said, although I probably will update the post with a little postscript. Keeping in mind that one of the things that I did make sure to say in that post is that a real priority for Tommen is to get his mother out of town. She became unstable and became really, really dangerous. I mean, she was always that awful combination of ruthless and stupid. And last night just, she finally went around the bend, and she finally stopped caring what the consequences were. And it finally became victory at any cost. Well, the problem with victory at any cost is the cost. In this case, of course, she lost her son, Tommen, as the old witch that she had talked to in a flashback a season or two ago had predicted, that she would lose all her children, and she did, and she hardly even seemed fazed by it. This is something that comes to mind when I think of both the left and of white nationalists, but let me talk a little bit about it in terms of white nationalists. The problem with having a movement, with having a strategy that's focused on hating somebody else instead of love for something that you are trying to protect, is that it ends up with what I would call Captain Ahab syndrome, which is you're so focused on slaying your white whale that becomes the only thing you're interested in, and it leads to self-destruction. Now, it should be obvious for Cersei, this already has not gone well for her, and it's going to continue to not go well for her. She's at the point where, let's look at the Seven Kingdoms right now. Who isn't in rebellion against the Iron Throne right now? So she's got House Martell down in Dorne. They're in basically open revolt against her. She's got the Tyrells in open revolt against her. House Stark has declared independence for the North. House Arryn has declared support for House Stark. It's starting to get that she is, she's quote-unquote the queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but that basically makes her no more than the queen of King's Landing. At this point, House Baratheon is essentially destroyed. So who's she got? The Lannisters? I mean, don't get me wrong, that's a lot of money and it's a big army, but against everybody else? And I know everybody else is really weak too, except, of course, Daenerys Targaryen, who is now crossing the Narrow Sea in a big fleet of ships with an army and 3 dragons, which is exactly what her ancestor had when he conquered Westeros. So, this will not end well for Cersei. She is not going to be on that throne for long, and things are going to come to terrible grief. For her and maybe for her house, because if it's House Lannister against everybody, then everybody's going to win. Pardon me while I take a sip of soda there. When I'm doing a podcast with other people, of course, they can say something while I take a little drink, but nobody else is here, so it's just me. So to get that back to white nationalism, it becomes so much about hurting black people, about hurting Jews, about hurting Hispanics, about getting back at them for some perceived injury that may be real, may be imagined, maybe a little bit of both. But when it's all about hurting your enemies instead of loving and preserving your friends, your family, your community, then self-destruction is an option that is on the table. Because if you have to self-destruct and you have to sacrifice everything that you love in order to destroy your enemies, well, if destroying your enemies is the top priority, then sure, that might not be your first option, but it's an option. It's on the table, it's available. Is there any reason why not, really? No. You could. And that's why I find that white nationalist movements do tend towards self-destruction. They tend towards also self-destructive beliefs. And these are all over the place. Take like the abandonment of Christianity. I hate to tell you guys this. The West is the faith, and the faith is the West. And saying that we're all going to adopt a more male-centric version of Wicca and then go out and slay our enemies like we were on a heavy metal album cover from 1986, well, it's not seeing what you're trying to preserve. So you cannot base a movement, an idea that's ever going to go anywhere, on hatred of other people. And yeah, okay, I know how that sounds. I know that it sounds like some, preachy leftists join hands and sing Kumbaya and all that bullshit. But it's not. It's, the old Chinese saying that if you start out for revenge, you dig 2 graves, one for the person that you're trying to hurt and one for yourself. It's true. And Cersei she's already dug a grave for her last child. And she's digging one for herself. And at this point, I don't think she even cares anymore. She's so lost in rage. She's so lost in hate that at this point, she really is burn it all. She took the throne just to take it. The point wasn't even that. The point was just revenge. So, yes, knowing that, Tommen should have packed her off to Casterly Rock and made his apologies to the High Sparrow later. And what happened was entirely predictable, and of course a lot of people did predict it. And the producers put plenty of hints in the preceding episodes. So where do the Seven Kingdoms go from here? Well, Daenerys is going to land. She's already got 2 noble houses ready to work with her. The question, of course, is whether or not she figures out that Jon Snow is a Targaryen before she ends up in the north. If so, I would tell her, make this offer. Legitimize Jon as a Targaryen. Recognize the independence of the North on the understanding that he, founding a northern branch of House Targaryen, will be the one to rule it. Therefore, both North and South are ruled by branches of the Targaryen family. Gives you everything you want, really. And that relates to the point I was trying to make about Tommen as a deal maker. Making deals is good. It's very satisfying on an emotional level to set off the wildfire and vaporize all your enemies. It's emotionally satisfying to see them cower in fear of your dragon. It's emotionally satisfying to march your army over them. But how many people is that going to hurt? How much is it going to hurt you? You know, look at the United States since 1945, starting one war after another that have weakened it. How much did the Vietnam War weaken this country? Whatever it was we set out to do, we accomplished damn near the opposite of it. Every time this country sets out to, on one of these damn fool crusades, we just end up weakening our own society, which is identical to opening it up to more leftism. You know, how far left did we shift after Vietnam? How far left have we shifted in the Obama administration? It should be apparent to us that these crusades are damaging our society. And all the wars have damaged Westeros too. You know, Robert unseated Aerys II for reasons that were both understandable and not. But it did destabilize things. Once you destabilize an order, it's really hard to build a new one. And once Robert himself went, it was chaos. You know, how much of the Seven Kingdoms been hurt by the War of the Five Kings? How much? You know, think of how much a better position they would be to defend themselves against the White Walkers if all of the things that had happened in the last few years in Westeros hadn't happened and they were still united. Not to mention, of course, that for those who were inclined to trying to stave off a Targaryen restoration, well, that's out the window. Daenerys is coming back now with her dragons, and everybody had better bow or be in heap big trouble. All of this stuff, all of these power grabs, all of these wars that seemed like a good idea at the time, all this expenditure of resources, the ruining of farmlands, the killing off of experienced soldiers, it's all stuff that leads the kingdom to ruin. It leaves it in a more vulnerable position. Now, of course, we might not think this way because to go back to something that Moldbug had talked about, or Hans Hermann Hoppe had talked about too, when a king spends money out of the treasury, he's spending his own money. When a democracy, when senators and congressmen spend money, they're spending OPM. So people will never be as careful with OPM as they are with their own money. But that's true about everything. That's true about soldiers' lives. That's true about social capital. And think of the expenditure of social capital that Vietnam represented. Think about the amount of it that we had in 1963 and the amount of it we had in 1973. And that is so hard to rebuild. We never successfully did it. We tried. The 80s were a good shot at it, but we never really rebuilt it. And now we're seeing where that leads, where we end up. So to us, you know, and this is why I think leftism gets into mass wars. The age of the huge war is an age of high civilization, but also of leftism. You know, medieval battles, like the ones you see in Game of Thrones, medieval wars, there were a lot of them, but they were short. They had low body counts. They were mediated pretty quickly by structures that were in place to do that. And, you know, of course, I'm talking in general. It's when you get into the modern age, starting with the early modern age, you know, in the late 15th, early 16th century, where you start seeing big, massive wars. Medieval wars were, a few teams of knights hacking away at each other. And part of that was because kingdoms were small, but also kings had limited resources. And every resource that they did expend came out of their pocket personally. So they couldn't afford to spend that much. A few really good knights was, a few hundred pikemen. That was all you got. You couldn't just throw massive amounts of OPM and OPS, other people's sons, at endless wars of ideological liberation. Medieval wars were also tended to be pretty practical. They tended to be about who got to sit on the throne, or they tended to be religious, most of which was, and I highly recommend you guys watch Stefan Molyneux's video on how the Crusades were defensive wars, and really were not the crimes that the left would have you believe they were. So the other thing that medieval wars did was stave off or kick out Islam, which, by the way, how's leftism doing at that? So the ideological war, which expends OPM and OPS, that's the mass war. That gives you Verdun, that gives you Stalingrad, that gives you Chosin Reservoir. And of course, it doesn't hurt that the left is completely fanatical and, 1 million casualties, 20. To create paradise, no price is too high. No price in money, no price in other people's lives, no price in destruction. There is no price too high to bring about paradise. Why would there be? So the left tend not to be deal makers. I mean, they'll sign an agreement and then they'll violate it the second that they think they can do it and get away with it. But deal making is good stuff. And everyone has to go into it understanding that they're not going to get everything they want. But if they can get if everybody can get the most important points to them, if everybody can get the one or two things that really matter, then everybody's made a good deal, and we can come away from this feeling positive about what happened. The deal that Tommen made with the High Sparrow, it worked. Everybody got enough out of it. The Tyrells kind of lost more than anybody else, but then again, compared to the alternative, which was Cersei's solution, well, how much did they lose there? And sorry, Mace, you should have had more kids. It's the medieval times, that's kind of important. Things happen. So having more than one heir is really where it's at. And so if Daenerys, and I think Tyrion is pulling her in this direction, if she tends towards deal making first and Dragonfire second, that's good. And I'm sorry, all the people who got pissed off at Tyrion for trying to make a deal with the slave masters, that again is a product of our leftist conditioning, in which slavery, especially, and let's say this, especially because in our imagination, slavery is the ultimate expression of racism, because in the United States it was race-based, mostly. And racism is, of course, the great modern sin. There is nothing in the world, not murder, not rape, not torture, nothing is as bad as not liking black people enough. That is the worst possible thing that anyone could do, except maybe possibly not liking gay people enough. So slavery falls for us into the category of sins associated with racism, which makes it the worst possible thing ever. And since we are of a leftist mindset in our society, since that is the paradigm on which we operate, we are willing to throw anything into stopping it. We are willing to throw unlimited amounts of OPM and OPS into stopping it. Whereas Tyrion made an absolutely rational cost-benefit analysis. 7 years isn't that long. If the slaves are all free after that, okay. And you're doing that in exchange for years of peace and of shoring up your own position. Now, the masters ended up attacking anyway, but was that because of the deal, or was that because Daenerys and her dragons weren't around and they figured they could get away with it? Well, the answer is there has to be some enforcement mechanism in deal-making. And this is something that Moldbug just recently got into with his analysis of the Tao, which is not, the Chinese thing. This is the thing related to that competitor to Bitcoin, whose name I forget at the moment, though. The one that had the ability to build contracts into transfers of their cryptocurrency, where the idea was that the law was the code. It was its own law, and as long as the code was executed faithfully, properly, whatever, then the deal was valid. Well, of course, someone figured out how to trick fuck this system and do something that ripped somebody off, but technically did execute the code. So, with their way of approaching things, there's no enforcement mechanism. And without Daenerys and her dragons and her Khalasar, there was no enforcement mechanism on the Masters, which, makes you kind of wonder why they agreed to the deal in the first place if they were just going to turn around and violate it immediately. But any deal without an enforcement mechanism of some kind is not a deal. So Tyrion made a deal without an enforcement mechanism in place, and that's what led to the demise of that deal. But it doesn't make deal-making a bad thing in and of itself. Tommen, of course, with his deal, needed some sort of enforcement mechanism against the Sparrows, and I recommended taking some time to build that up once the deal is signed. But, of course, he never got the chance because his mother took things into her own hands and blew the whole thing up. But deal-making, when you can do it, when you have a good enforcement mechanism, when everybody gets everything they want, well, again, not everything they want, when they get the important things to them, when they get a deal they can live with, that's way better than any other option. I'm not the biggest fan of Ayn Rand, but she was right when she said, if you've got something and I want it, there's really only two ways we can go about handling that situation, which is either we can make some kind of deal and I can exchange you something for it. And to Rand, since she was kind of one-dimensional, to her that only meant an exchange of money or payment of some kind. And of course there's lots of other things that you can pay for something with. Lots of other ways you can make a deal. Trade rights, trade favors, grant concessions, all sorts of stuff. There's really only two ways we can handle it. And one of them is we can make a deal. Two, we can fight over it. And fighting over it is bad news for everybody. If we have to fight over it, something serious and fundamental failed. And that is shame for everybody involved. So that's the way that I would get through things if I were Daenerys Targaryen. Play let's make a deal with the North, just as she did with the Iron Islands. Have everybody else bend the knee, institute some sort of reforms, have the Targaryens stop marrying each other, because we have seen that in the universe of Game of Thrones, incest leads to madness. Not just with the Targaryens, but that was Joffrey too. So, outlaw that. You can make some sort of rule that if there's a queen, then her husband has to take her name. Whatever. Just as long as you do something to keep the Targaryens on the Iron Throne. Restore the reforms for the small folk of Aegon V. And there you go. Things are going good. That, of course, is what I would do, but who knows where things go from here in the novels. Either way, you know, with Game of Thrones, Episode 9 tends to be the big battle. I would predict next season's Episode 9 is where Cersei goes out. I would predict that there will be, that Episode 9 of Season 7 will be a battle for King's Landing, and Cersei's going to lose. What exact shape that takes, I don't know. But Daenerys is going to get King's Landing back. And I would guess that Season 8, which there have already been hints that will be the last season, will be taking care of all the problems of the North. We're going to figure out the legal status of the North with the Seven Kingdoms. Are they going to be independent? Are they going to stay in the fold? What's going to go on there? And we're going to take care of the White Walkers. At which point, end of show. After which, of course, I would really love to see them go ahead and do a Dunk and Egg TV series, because, you know, I'm a Targaryen guy myself, so more Targaryens am good as far as I'm concerned. And I'd love to see it all the way from when Dunk and Egg meet up right up to Summerhall. Also, for anyone angry at the High Sparrow for not letting everyone leave the second that Marjorie said there was trouble, did you see the size of that explosion? Even if they had left the second that Marjorie figured out that something was wrong, they wouldn't have been able to get away from that. Not even a chance. That scene where the bell goes flying and then the street fills up with wildfire, how far away was that? So, no, sorry, the High Sparrow did not get everybody killed. They were toast no matter what. In fact, it might have even been worse for them if the Sparrow had let them go, because instead of just being relatively painlessly incinerated in about half a second, they might have really been set on fire to have that take a couple of minutes to kill them. So, no, sorry, I don't buy that complaint at all. One other thing to bring up. People say that Game of Thrones has no moral center. You know, it's a really amoral show. And I don't believe that's the truth. I don't know whether George R.R. Martin planned this or not, but I believe Game of Thrones has a very Aristotelian moral center. In other words, I think more or less it is based on the Golden Mean. The idea that what's bad is to be too much of any extreme. Famously, Aristotle said, in relating to bravery, if you're not brave enough, you're a coward, and everyone's going to walk all over you, and you're going to end up a slave. If you're too brave, then you're going to just end up being suicidal. You're going to be reckless. You're going to take stupid risks. You're going to get yourself killed for nothing. And then somebody's going to sweep in, invade your country, take your women, all of that kind of stuff. One could, for example, say that what was wrong with the Japanese army during World War II was that they were too eager to die for their emperor and not eager enough to fight for him. Sometimes you got to retreat. You know, the Long March in the Chinese Revolution, that was a retreat. The communists staged this big, long retreat and made the nationalists chase them all over China. And that retreat turned out to be a huge victory for the communists. You need experienced soldiers. They can't just kill themselves the second that they lose a battle in shame. They can't just go down with their ships. Otherwise, you end up with battles like Midway or the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where a bunch of noobs get completely dominated by the other side's experienced soldiers who, hey, took a loss or two here and there. But they kept fighting. So any extreme is bad. And I think you see that in Game of Thrones. I think people who are too merciful and people who aren't merciful enough both end up losing. I think people who are too honorable, like Ned Stark, or not honorable enough, end up losing. I think people who are too militant or not militant enough end up losing. And people could call that being unprincipled. I don't think it is. What good did Ned Stark do to anybody in the end? By being too honorable, by refusing to play the game, what good did he do? What good did he do compared to Tyrion, who's a little bit more underhanded? And yeah, if you take that extreme out to its conclusion, you end up with a guy like Littlefinger, who will do anything to get power, or even worse, you end up with Cersei, who will do anything to get power, including what we just saw at the Sept of Baelor. I think in the end, the moral center of Game of Thrones is trying to tell you everything in moderation, nothing too extreme, every virtue tempered by a counter virtue. That is the moral center of Game of Thrones, and it's a worthwhile one. There is a lot to be said for the Golden Mean, for the Aristotelian worldview. Again, it doesn't quite appeal to us because we live in such an ideological age. We live in an age of totalism. We live in an age of extremism. We live in the age of, sacrificing millions to make a point. Like the Chinese Cultural Revolution or Stalin, the Holodomor. I'll starve, 3 million Ukrainians to make a point about collective farms. That's the zeitgeist of our age, of being willing to pay any price and do anything in order to impose paradise on people and to bring about utopia at gunpoint. And that too is not a virtue, which I think we will end up seeing eventually. So that's where I think you find real morality in Game of Thrones, despite people complaining that it's a completely amoral show. It isn't. That's about it for my take on this season of Game of Thrones and sort of my musings on it relating to the real world. I got a question on, just one more. I had a question on Ask FM, asking me if I thought that Daenerys is just Samantha Power with a nicer ass. My answer is, I don't think so. I don't I don't know that democracy is where they're going to go with this. There's some troubling things like her saying, have the people of Marine choose their own leaders. I don't like that too much, but she seems pretty set on being Queen of Westeros. And I would guess that that's going to be pretty inflexible. Anything else? Yeah, you know what? One more word about the Sparrows. Everybody seem to hate the High Sparrow. And surprise, surprise, I don't. There is a populist interpretation that could easily be put on the Sparrows. In fact, frankly, there's a damn near Marxist interpretation that could be put on them. And this relates to, I think, how the left has degenerated over the last, certainly 50 years or so. So, let's start out with the Sparrows. The nobles of Westeros deserved the High Sparrow for everything they did, for having wrecked their kingdoms in power struggles, for having spent OPM and OPS profligately, for their own idleness and degeneracy and drunkenness and scheming. They absolutely deserved the High Sparrow. What is wrong with somebody holding this group of nobles to some level of account? That's what the church is supposed to do. That's how stability worked in the medieval world, is, yes, the kings had their authority, but it wasn't quite absolute, because they were balanced off by the power of the church. For example, the Byzantine emperor, I believe it was Theodosius, who was forced to repent after he put Thessalonica to the sword. So Thessalonica was part of the Byzantine Empire, rebelled against the emperor retook it, and he ordered basically a big old slaughter, which he regretted before too long and stopped before it killed basically everyone. But still, the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, refused to give him communion until he publicly repented. And I mean, by publicly repented, I mean walked around the streets of the city in sackcloth and ashes, just like Cersei's walk of shame. And eventually he made the emperor do it. And good, the emperor should have done it. What he did was wrong, and he needed to repent, and other people in positions of power needed to understand that that was something that they need not to do. They need to not put cities to the sword. No, that's wrong. And I think what was wrong with it as far as the audience is concerned is just that they felt attachment to the nobles. You know, they felt bad for Marjorie because she's pretty. You know, in the same way that Game of Thrones was, and you know, I'm sorry, I hate to sound leftist here, I really do. But Game of Thrones was full of rape, and nobody said much of anything about it until the pretty upper-class white girl got raped. You know, then once it happened to Sansa Stark, everybody was outraged. Well, you know, there is something to that complaint. I'm not going to say that there isn't. And same thing, you know, the Sparrows put the gay dude, and of course being gay is high status now. And not only that, let's be honest, the attractive white upper class gay dude. They put him in jail. They put his attractive white upper class sister in jail. And all of a sudden everybody's upset. Because we identify with them, or at least we want to. They're aspirational. We want to be them. And also, the walk of shame that the Sparrows gave Cersei. Everybody ought to hate Cersei. She completely deserved that walk of shame. And yet, and this is something that George R.R. Martin was really clever with, that is the ultimate female nightmare. Not just public humiliation, but public sexual humiliation in front of an entire city. Being shamed is the ultimate female nightmare. Being sexually shamed in public, oh boy. It's hard to imagine anyone being bad enough that women wouldn't cringe at that as a punishment. And Martin knew that. That's why he designed that punishment. But really, the High Sparrows and all of his sparrows, they held a bunch of profligate upper-class twats to account for all of the bad things that they had done, for all of the money they had wasted, the resources they had wasted, the farms that had been burned, the other people's sons who had died, for basically nothing. Someone should do that. I mean, if you take religion out of it, then the High Sparrow is, in a way, a very leftist figure. He is a Marxist fantasy in the ways that Marxism had some kind of point. Because, yeah, nobles shouldn't do shitty things. They should think of the small folk first. They should think of their kingdom first. And when they don't, somebody should hold them to account. Now, not like Robespierre did, not like Lenin did, and one could even say that it was some religious mercy that held back the High Sparrow from doing that. Some recognition that, yes, the faith and the crown are the twin pillars that hold up Westeros, and that, no, you shouldn't screw around with that. But again, if we take that as far as just holding these motherfuckers to some kind of account, what is wrong with that? I don't see anything wrong with that. But again, you know, people identify with the rich and beautiful. They want to be them. And so those become the good guys. And this also ties in to the ways in which leftism has degenerated. Leftism, let's not forget, started out as a movement to uplift the poor, downtrodden worker. People toiling away in factories or trying to scratch a living out of the ground on farms. And it was to represent them against the effete, degenerate, overeducated, urban elites. They of intoxication and weird sexual practices, they of softness and effeminacy. And boy, oh boy, has that ever been flipped 180 degrees on its head. Because now, the left could not possibly give a shit less about the working class, and especially the white working class. You know, they'll make a noise here and there, but they don't care about them. Not at all. They need the welfare class for their power, but they have never forgiven the working class for not being Tom Joad. They've never forgiven them for clinging to their guns and religion. They've never forgiven them, really, honestly, for the fact that hard leftism, that communism never really became a movement of the workers and the farmers, that it was always a movement of the bourgeois. It was then, and it is now, and it never won't be. It is the bourgeois who look up to the likes of Marjorie and Loris Tyrell. It is the bourgeois who have the aspirations to be them. It is the bourgeois, too, who have altered leftism so that the downtrodden that we care about now are the poor, downtrodden urban elites, effete, effeminate, overeducated, of deviant sexual practice, so that the people who need defending, the people who leftism are concerned with, are now no longer some blue-collar guy with a wrench or a scythe in his hand, but is the urban homosexual, or better yet, transsexual, living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, having a hipster lifestyle. That is why, while the leftists of 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, would have identified with the High Sparrow, today they identify with the Tyrells. And what that shows you about where leftism is, and frankly, also explains the Trump phenomenon. It explained the Reagan Democrats in the 80s, and then as Pat Buchanan pointed out, the Republican Party pissed that advantage away by selling them out. Trump wants them back and is serious about wanting them back, and he'll have them back. Now, whether it's enough, now that our country has been flooded with tens of millions of dirt-poor third-worlders to be a voting bloc for the Democratic Party, guess we'll find out in a few months. In a way, it's a shame, leftism at least, while always a heresy, at least had some noble intention behind it. Look, I'm something of a Dickens scholar. I wrote my master's thesis on Dickens. So I know a lot about the 19th century, and I can tell you that when Friedrich Engels walked through the slums of mid-19th century Manchester and saw the misery of the industrial workers there, he wasn't making it up. His solution may have been bad, but you would have to be horribly inhuman to have looked at that and not said, somebody needs to do something about this. Somebody needs to change something so that this doesn't keep going on. And leftism at least used to be that. It used to be a bad answer, but at least it was a bad answer to a decent question. Now that it's just the sword and the shield of sexual degeneracy, hipsterism, effeminacy, the desire for something for nothing, the desire for grown adults to never grow up and always have someone there to take care of them if they scrape their knee. It's all reflected in how much people didn't like the Sparrows for doing exactly what leftism is supposed to do. Hold rich and powerful people to account for the bad decisions that they make. All right, that really is about as much as I've got to say about season 6, episode 10 of Game of Thrones. I'll keep recording as things strike me, as I think of new things to talk about, and as my throat heals a little bit after an hour of nonstop talking to you. So expect more on the channel. These will be uploaded as I find myself having Wi-Fi to actually upload them. Hopefully I'll get some in Vegas. If not, well, you'll get this when you get it. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you more somewhere down the road.